أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء وسيد المرسلين وحبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم محمد، وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المكرمين الغرر الميامين، سيما بقية الله في الأراضين وحجته على الخلائق أجمعين، سيدنا وإمام زماننا وصاحب نعمتنا وولي أمرنا، مهدي هذه الأمة وطاووس أهل الجنة، الحجة بن الحسن العسكري فداه أرواح العالمين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام على المهدي الذي وعد الله عز وجل به الأمم أن يجمع به الكلم ويلم به الشعث ويملأ به الأرض قسطا وعدلا ويمكن له وينجز به وعد المؤمنين. My dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I pray that you are all in the best of health and iman, and hopefully charged up and hyped up and excited to delve into another important topic which will lay the foundations of important discussions to come in the future, inshallah. The topic actually addresses one of the phenomenon that is perhaps less talked about. It's seldom discussed, but it is very, very important nonetheless. And as time progresses and as the environment we're in continues to evolve and change, we're seeing the negative side effects come to the fore more repeatedly. And so I want to discuss the topic tonight, and we could perhaps get started with our slides, inshallah, so that you could follow along, inshallah. As a matter of fact, what I can do at this point is share the slides on the Telegram channel, so that if you would like to follow along, hopefully you can do so as well. So let me just very quickly export the PDF for the slides, because I know some of you probably have a hard time reading the text from the slides that I'm going to show. So let's do that. All right, so PDF. This is Christianity 104. Okay. So if you go into the Telegram group, the official eHausa channel there, you'll find the PDF that I'm uploading right now. Okay, it's uploading. So we're going to get started, inshallah, while you do that. But of course, everything in the slides is going to be shown on screen anyway. So if you don't want to open that and be distracted by the PDF, you can continue to watch here. So let's jump right into this. Okay.
Playing from Syed's Mac Mini.
All right, you should be able to see the slides right now. Okay. Just resizing. This is the tedious part of having to teach online classes. Okay, so we said that we've been discussing Christianity. And in the previous session, we talked about the biblical prophet Abraham, or Ibrahim. May God's peace and blessings be upon our prophet, his family, and upon Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. And we talked about some of the differences in the biblical narrative versus the Islamic narrative. And today what I want to do is take a step back. As I said, the topic tonight is not directly related to Christianity, but it is a foundational discussion which does clarify a lot of things moving forward, inshallah. So do pay attention. And it's called the Pathology of Polemics. Pathology, you might be thinking, what has that got anything to do with the study of comparative religions, and in particular, polemical discussions and debates? Well, pathology is the study of disease and the root cause of disease. Essentially, what I mean by pathology is not in the medical sense of the term, but rather in the intellectual sense of the term, meaning the negative side effects, the problematic elements of polemical debates. And polemics, for those who aren't familiar with this expression or this word, is essentially engaging in discussions with people of different intellectual persuasions and religious denominations, with the intent of proving them wrong. We talked a little bit about this in the I believe, Christianity 101 and 102, but tonight we want to delve a little deeper into this. So before we actually talk about polemics and engaging in debates with people of different religions and whatnot, one thing has to be crystal clear. And that is that obviously we live in a time where access to information and engagement with people of different faiths and intellectual backgrounds is much, much easier, which in turn, it encourages many people to engage in these kinds of debates. And you know, we do face what we can call an activist generation. And it's the generation of young, energetic people who feel motivated to get out there and engage in these kinds of discussions. Now, at one end of the extreme, these discussions become hostile and they become extremely aggressive. But at the other end of the scale, these discussions take a much more mellow, much more moderate vibe. And it may be motivated by the idea that we should spread the word, that we should engage with other people with the intent of inviting them to the truth. A verse that I'm sure you're very familiar with in this space is the verse in Surah An-Nahl, verse number 125, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Ud'u ila sabili rabbika bil hikmati wal maw'izati al hasana." Invite or call onto the path of your Lord with wisdom and good admonition or exhortation, and dispute with them, وَجَادِلْهُمْ بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ, and dispute with them in the better way. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Verily your Lord knows better of him who has gone astray from his path, and he knows best those who are guided." So this verse is often used by preachers, by people who feel a calling to engage in these kinds of discussions. Now, you can call them tabligh, you can call them da'wah, you can call them whatever you want, but essentially they're based on the idea that as Muslims we have a calling, we have a mission to deliver the message of Islam to other people. And of course, we wouldn't be this wouldn't be exclusive to Muslims. Many other religions, perhaps the vast majority of religions, have a vested interest in increasing their membership and inviting more people to join them to increase their numbers and to beef up their footprint, their presence, if you like. And so the verse is, seems pretty clear cut. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, call to the path of your Lord, which means, hence the term da'wah. Da'wah comes from this. Da'wah is to invite. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, ud'u, invite them, so we invite them. However, before we engage in this practice or in this exercise, we need to remind ourselves that as Muslims, as people who submit to the word of God, every step must be carefully measured against religious laws. And so, even though it may appear that this is a calling to each and every single Muslim, and that it is part of a Muslim identity to invite people to the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to invite them to Islam, and it appears as though it's the obvious thing to do. However, prior to engaging in this exercise, we also believe that everything we do, every single act, has to be measured against religious laws. It has to be verified by the laws of God, whether those laws are articulated in the Quran or the traditions of the Ahlul Bayt, right? And so we're faced with the activist generation, which either falls into one of two extremes. Either they want to proselytize, meaning they want to invite people, they want to convert people to Islam, and they fall into a very wide range, as I said earlier. Those debates or those discussions or proselytization efforts may be benign and very, if you like, friendly, or they could get very aggressive. So that's one extreme. The other extreme is complete assimilation, to forego our religious identity and to not engage in any such activities or exercises based on the fact that this is the best thing to do at a time when Islam is antagonized and vilified, and so best thing is to steer clear from all that sort of stuff. Just do what you have to do, or in fact assimilate into the host culture. Don't try to engage in any such activities, even in your own personal life. So these are two ends of the extreme. And so ultimately we go back to this point that we made earlier about, shouldn't we ask a more fundamental question, which is, well, what does God say about all of this? What do we have to do? Sure, the verse that I recited seems pretty, it seems on the leaning on the side of the idea that we have to be missionaries for this religion, but is that truly the case? In order to talk about this particular verse, I want to share with you this hadith. If one of the brothers or sisters can actually look up the English translation of this from the English version of Al-Kafi, that would be wonderful, so that we can share it with the rest of the class. The hadith is in Al-Kafi, volume number 5, so it's in Furu' Al-Kafi, page number 13. And it's actually the beginning, it's the first hadith in the chapter that's titled Man yajibu alayhi al-jihad wa man la yajib. Who jihad is made mandatory for and who jihad is not mandatory for. In other words, jihad, and we'll get to explain that a little bit later, inshallah, but we all believe as Muslims, unless you happen to be a member of these fringe elements, these extremist groups which believe that jihad must be practiced at all times and in all situations. Generally speaking, Muslims acknowledge that jihad is a practice that has its time and place. More specifically, jihad is a religious obligation that is governed by a very strict set of laws, right? In other words, polemical encounters must be governed by an elaborate set of laws and directives. A very good example of that is jihad, right? So I'll mention this hadith here. So let's see. Brother Taqi's mentioned, okay. So the link that you've provided is the Arabic version. I'll try and translate while somebody tries to look up the English version, inshallah. So the hadith is in narrated by Ali ibn Ibrahim عن أبيه عن بكر بن صالح عن القاسم بن بريد عن أبي عمرو الزبيري عن أبي عبد الله عليه السلام. Connected chain to Imam al-Sadiq عليه السلام. قال قلت له أخبرني عن الدعاء إلى الله. This narrator, Abi Amr, says, I said to the Imam, tell me about these two things. Ad-du'a ila Allah, inviting to the path of Allah, meaning what we find in the verse there, ud'u ila sabili rabbik, preaching and proselytizing and inviting to the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Tell me about this, meaning the conditions of it, as well as al-jihad fi sabilih. So the chapter is Bab Man Yajibu Alayhi Al-Jihad wa Man La Yajib, Volume 5. Upon whom jihad is obligatory and upon whom it is not obligatory. Okay? So he says, I asked the Imam to tell me about these two things, da'wah and jihad. أهو لقوم لا يحل إلا لهم ولا يقوم به إلا من كان منهم أم هو مباح لكل من وحد الله عز وجل وآمن برسوله. He says, I said to the Imam, are these two things activities that are exclusive to certain groups or individuals, or are they applicable to all people who believe in the oneness of Allah, meaning all Muslims? وآمن برسوله. ومن كان كذا فله أن يدعو إلى الله عز وجل وإلى طاعته وأن يجاهد في سبيله. Does that mean that anyone who believes in the unicity of God and the prophethood of the messenger, they can call on to the way of God and practice jihad? Or, as he said earlier, is this exclusive to certain people? فَقَالَ ذَلِكَ لِقَوْمٍ لَا يَحِلُّ إِلَّا لَهُمْ. The Imam said, no, this is applicable on people and it's exclusive to them. لَا يَحِلُّ إِلَّا لَهُمْ. It is not permissible except for them. وَلَا يَقُومُ بِذَلِكَ إِلَّا مَنْ كَانَ مِنْهُمْ. And only people who are members of this group are allowed to practice these two things. قُلْتُ مَنْ أُولَئِكَ. He said, well, who are these people? What conditions must they have before they're able to apply these two things? قال, I'm reading this bit by the way. قال من قام بشرائط الله عز وجل في القتال والجهاد على المجاهدين. Those who fulfill the conditions of this activity, of this exercise. The Imam mentions that one of the conditions is that they must be allowed to engage in jihad against the enemies of Allah. وَالْجِهَادِ عَلَى الْمُجَاهِدِينَ فَهُوَ الْمَأْذُونُ لَهُ فِي الدُّعَاءِ إِلَى اللَّهِ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ. That person is the one who is allowed to invite to the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, I don't want to get into the specifics of this hadith and why the Imam made a condition of da'wah, a condition of preaching and proselytization to engage in jihad. But the point of this hadith is to illustrate that there are conditions. This isn't something that is available or applicable to everyone. قلت فبين لي يرحمك الله. He said, please explain further. He said to the Imam. قال إن الله تبارك وتعالى أخبر نبيه في كتابه الدعاء إليه. Allah, the Imam said that God told his prophet in the Quran to invite to his path, to engage in tabligh and da'wah. ووصف الدعاة إليه. And God described those who engage in da'wah. فجعل ذلك لهم درجات يعرف بعضها أو يعرف بعضها بعضا ويستدل بعضها على بعض. فأخبر أنه تبارك وتعالى أول من دعا إلى نفسه ودعا إلى طاعته. The Imam is essentially saying that there are certain conditions that have to be met, and those conditions have been stipulated in the Quran. ودعا إلى طاعته واتباع أمره فبدأ بنفسه. And Allah, the first thing he did in the Quran, the Imam says, is that he presented himself, meaning God is the one who invites and practices da'wah. And the Imam cites this verse, وَاللَّهُ يَدْعُو إِلَى دَارِ السَّلَامِ وَيَهْدِي مَنْ يَشَاءُ إِلَى صِرَاطٍ مُسْتَقِيمٍ. This is in Surah Yunus, verse number 25. The Imam is saying that God is the one who engages in da'wah, which means that da'wah is a very special area that is not available and applicable to everyone. ثُمَّ ثَنَّى بِرَسُولِهِ. Then God made the Prophet the second person to engage in da'wah. فقال ادع إلى سبيل ربك بالحكمة والموعظة الحسنة وجادلهم بالتي هي أحسن, which is the verse that we recited earlier in Surah An-Nahl. So the Imam is reminding us that this verse is addressing the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Ud'u is a command to the Messenger of God, meaning, O Messenger, ud'u ila sabili rabbik, invite or call onto the path of your Lord. So the Imam is basically saying that this verse is not an invitation for every single person to engage in da'wah. It's addressing the Prophet. Now, here's a really critical exegesis that the Imam provides, explanation of this verse. Remember at the end of the verse we said, وَجَادِلْهُمْ بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ, and dispute with them in the better way. So, there has been a lot of discussion about what this means. بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ. Some have said in a good way, some have said in a manner that is appropriate. But the Imam gives us an explanation of what ahsan here means. What is the better way? The Imam says, we're reading this bit here. وَجَادِلْهُمْ بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ. يعني, the meaning of بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ, بِالْقُرْآن. It means to use the Quran when engaging in these debates. Now, this is a critical point which I'll get back to later on, inshallah. ولم يكن داعيا إلى الله عز وجل من خالف أمر الله ويدعو إليه بغير ما أمر به في كتابه. The Imam therefore says that based on this, those who invite to the way of God, those who proselytize, those who preach, those who engage in polemical discussions, they cannot defy the teachings of God, the orders of God, and then invite to His way. Or to invite to the way of Allah using other than what has been mentioned in the Quran. In other words, the methodology with which we invite has to be based on the Quran. Right? Again, I'll get back to that point later, inshallah. وَالَّذِي أَمَرَ أَنْ لَا يُدْعَى إِلَّا بِهِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has provided a very strict framework. The Imam is saying that in the Quran, there are strict directives as to how you should preach and invite to the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and how you shouldn't engage in this exercise. If you defy that, meaning that if you choose any other methodology that's outside of the Quran, that is unacceptable. وَقَالَ فِي نَبِيِّهِ. Then God said about His Prophet, وَإِنَّكَ لَتَهْدِي إِلَى صِرَاطٍ مُسْتَقِيمٍ. You surely, verily, guide to the straight path. يَقُولُ تَدْعُو ثم ثلث بالدعاء. Again, the Imam is emphasizing the role of the Prophet, that this is a directive to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. ثم ثلث بالدعاء إليه بكتابه أيضا تبارك وتعالى. Then Allah said that the third, if you like, entity that engages in these invitations and da'wah is the Holy Quran. إن هذا القرآن يهدي للتي هي أقوم. أي يدعو. The Imam says, this is verily, this Quran is what invites. أي يدعو ويبشر المؤمنين, and provides glad tidings to the believers. So the Quran is a means of invitation. ثم ذكر من أذن له في الدعاء إليه بعده وبعد رسوله في كتابه فقال. Now, at this stage, the Imam, subhanAllah, he's using all of these incredible citations from the Quran to build this case and to draw a picture of the methodology and the directives involved in da'wah and invitation and preaching. The Imam says, God is the first to invite, then the Prophet, then the Quran, then at the last stage, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described individuals who may engage in these activities and said, وَلْتَكُنْ مِنْكُمْ أُمَّةٌ يَدْعُونَ إِلَى الْخَيْرِ وَيَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ وَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Imran verse 104, there should be among you a group, ummah, a nation, that invites to goodness and enjoins good and forbids evil. وَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ. They are the righteous ones. Now, this verse alone suggests that not everyone should engage in this. There are specific groups or individuals that have been given the permission to engage in this exercise, and not every single person is allowed to do this. Now, what I want to draw your attention to here is some examples of the side effects of polemical debates. Then I'll mention a few ahadith which are absolutely instrumental in this. The reason I say this is, once again, we have an activist generation. And the activist generation oftentimes loses sight. These individuals who engage in this kind of exercise, they lose sight of a number of critical factors which must be present before a person is given permission to engage in tabligh and da'wah. The first is that alaykum anfusakum. The number one priority, as stipulated in the Quran and the traditions of the Ahlul Bayt, is yourself. Meaning that you cannot fix the world when you are unable to fix yourself. You cannot be a force for good for the rest of the world, engaging in every campaign that's out there. And there are too many campaigns running simultaneously at all times. I'm sure any of you who is involved or has any social media presence, for example, will recognize exactly what I'm saying here, right? There are too many things out there, too many problems to fix, too many campaigns to run, too many issues to address, too many injustices that are happening around the world. And you're often left perplexed and bewildered and unable to decide what to do, what to focus on, what to prioritize, and what to engage in. The Quran is very clear on this. The Quran says, start with yourself. Ensure that you are a righteous person before you try to fix other people. Sure, many of these campaigns, they address real grievances, real oppression is taking place, genuine problems exist all over the world. However, oftentimes what tends to happen is, if you spend any amount of time trying to trying to engage in those campaigns and trying to be plugged in, so to speak, and contribute to those issues, even at the level of discussion, and not even, going out there and physically trying to fix things, even by discussing these things with other people, you tend to lose sight of your priority, which is yourself. You tend to compromise on improving your own spiritual well-being, your own beliefs, your own connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with God and the prophets and God's emissaries. You make concessions in those areas, and because you simply don't have enough time. There's not enough hours in the day for you to become an activist protesting in the street, while at the same time building your own character and your own beliefs and your own intellect. So that's one of the side effects of this activist generation, right? There are too many others to list. I don't want to get into that, but this is something that we need to keep in mind. Now, I want to list some of the side effects of polemical debates. And again, I'm not singling out any individuals. I'm not saying that, every single person who's engaged in polemical discussions with other faiths and religions, because again, we tend to be dragged into this. As Muslims, as Shia, as followers of the Ahlul Bayt, we often find ourselves, in a position where we are a minority within a minority within a minority within a larger majority, right? And so we're often at the receiving end of criticism, of hate and vitriol, right? And because we find ourselves in that position where we're being oppressed, we're being targeted, we're being subjugated, we tend to try and push back against all that. And, as a very simple example, you find groups out there, for example, that are trying to, attack and demonize the Shia of the Ahlul Bayt, whether they're Salafi / Wahhabi or whatever religious persuasion they follow. But in particular, those groups, they are extremely aggressive. They don't have any red lines. They will lie through their teeth. They will actively try to demonize the Shia, which often leads to the Shia being physically harmed, right? We've seen this, and we've seen it for many, many decades and centuries. And so it's normal, in a way, it's natural, I should say, for a Shia to watch these and to listen to these and to be sort of aggravated into wanting to respond. However, the case I'm making in this class is that we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't fall for that. As I said, let's not lose sight of our priorities. The number one priority is yourself. The number one priority is your beliefs, your practices, your character, your connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Trying to respond to every idiot with, I guess for lack of a better term, every aggressor, every liar, every deceiver, every imposter. If we did that, then we would most definitely lose sight of our priorities. We would not do what we're supposed to do, and instead we'll be sucked down this rabbit hole of trying to respond to all of these different arguments that are being put forth. And so what happens is, because our priorities fall out of line, there are certain side effects that take place. And I want to draw your attention to some of them here that I listed. Again, there are so many, but these are just some of the few that I've seen and I've observed, in particular in the Shia community, and especially those that speak the English language. So the first side effect, the first pathology, if you like, is creating individuals that are defeatist and apologetic, right? And I'll explain that. So people who try to allocate mental space in their lives to engage in such activities fall into several categories. One of them is that they will easily concede when presented with arguments that are well articulated and strong, in the sense that this individual doesn't have the mechanism or the knowledge to respond to those arguments, right? Not that the arguments themselves are strong, right? Because oftentimes they would resort to logical fallacies, and they would resort to all manner of different methodologies in those debates, right? A debate, just because a debater happened to win the motion doesn't mean that they're right. The fact that they achieve victory in a debate setting could be attributed to any number of different factors. It could be the fact that they're linguistically stronger. It means that they can articulate themselves better. It means, or it could be because they're able to woo the crowds. They're able to win the crowds with, arguments that seem strong at face value, which the average person is not privy to the inherent weaknesses in those arguments, right? Again, using logical fallacies. I'll give you a very simple example, right? Imagine a physician, a doctor, comes to you and says, yes, thank you, Sister Zina, for sharing the hadith, the English translation of the hadith. Yes. So imagine somebody tells you that smoking harms you. Smoking is harmful. It could cause cancer. It could, contribute to diabetes and whatnot. That is a valid argument, right? There is evidence out there to suggest that that smoking is harmful, right? Now, the smoker might turn around and use the logical fallacy known as argument ad hominem and say, hang on a second, aren't you a smoker, right? Didn't you smoke? I saw you the other day smoking. Now, in a debate setting, especially when you're dealing with, a large mass of people who are not educated as much, right? Responding very quickly to the argument about the harmful effects of smoking by using argument ad hominem, saying that, hey, you're a smoker yourself. So, maybe glass houses, maybe you should start with yourself. Even though the smoker has not really responded to the substance of the argument, but he may get a standing ovation. He may get a cheer from the audience because he was able to make the physician look as though he's a hypocrite. You'll notice a lot of such arguments in presidential debates. You'll find them in political discussions all the time, right? So it's not about truth versus falsehood. It's really about how you can articulate yourself, how you're able to present your argument. And so individuals who are not equipped with the knowledge, and again, I'll get to that inshallah later in this hadith, which I want to quote. But if you don't have the solid foundation, and you haven't fulfilled the conditions of being a da'i, the conditions of being a preacher, then you might fall for those fallacious arguments. And you end up becoming defeatist, right, in your mentality. You end up becoming an apologetic. So not only do you lose the argument, but gradually these individuals, and again, I've seen many examples like this, gradually they will make concessions about their beliefs at the expense of God's religion. There's so many examples I can cite here, but I don't want to, because I think that will create many sidetracks and too many questions where a lot of people might say, well, what about this then? What about this argument? But my point here is, if the other party, if the other side engages in whataboutery, right? If they say, for example, the Prophet married Aisha when she was 9 years old, right? Now, whether that's true or not is another discussion. But let's say you're speaking about women's rights as a Muslim. You go out there and you're talking about women's rights and you're talking about the importance of ensuring that child marriages and these sorts of discussions. As someone who's who's put themselves in a position of polemical debater, the second the other side says, well, what about your Prophet? You now have a very small number of options. You can either say that, well, that's not true, and we can debate whether this was true or not, right? And even though there might be strong evidence, again, this is all hypothetical, but there might be very strong evidence to suggest that the Prophet did marry a wife when she was 9 years old, or that Amir al-Mu'mineen married Fatima to Zahra when she was 9 years old, or 10 years old, or whatever it is, right? But because you've put yourself in that awkward position, what's going to happen is you might either reject that and say, no, that's not true. It's debatable. The authenticity of these reports are debatable, right? So you end up, because of this apologetic mentality, this defeatist mentality, you will reject what you know to be true. Or the other option is that you will actually criticize what the Prophet did. And you will criticize you will talk about the permissibility. You will try and join the other camp and say, look, I'm with you on that, right? But we're speaking more broadly. Islam did provide many rights for women and so on and so forth. So you see what's happened here. By simply putting yourself in that position, you have been pushed into a corner, and now you have to make concessions, right? Again, this is all hypothetical. These are all examples. I'm just trying to establish the foundations here. The second side effect of polemical debates is the use of falsehood to defeat falsehood, right? And I'll talk a little bit about this later on, inshallah. But essentially, if you go to the previous hadith which we talked about, where the Imam says that you have to use the Quran, you have to use the signs of Allah, the verses of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran. If you're trying to debate with an atheist, for instance, and you use philosophical arguments, and we've talked about this at length in theology class in the pre-Hawza course, for those of you who attended those classes, and if you haven't, you can go back and listen to those. I've provided many examples of that. Someone who's debating with an atheist might be tempted to use a philosophical argument, but the philosophical argument is inherently broken. In other words, there is a philosophical response and rebuttal to your philosophical argument. Essentially what you've done is that you've used falsehood in order to reject the falsehood of the other side. In order to disprove the belief in atheism, you've used an argument that is inherently flawed, right? This is also one of the side effects of engaging in polemical debates, which means that not everyone should do this. Number 3, entrapment by the opponent. And again, there are many examples of that, but essentially it's when the opponent engages in a line of arguments that ultimately pushes you into a corner that you cannot come out of. And there are many examples. We'll leave that for another time, inshallah, but that's one of the side effects, which ultimately leads the individual to either make concessions or to appear extremely foolish, or to create a bigger problem than what he or she is trying to address, right? In other words, you create more questions in the mind of the audience and the mind of the viewer than you originally intended to address. Number 4, giving falsehood a platform within the realm of the truth. And by that I mean, oftentimes what happens is, if you're trying to engage in polemical debates, the setting for the debate is a very important part of the preparation. So both parties have to agree on the time and the place and the format that the debate is supposed to take place. But what you're doing inadvertently is that you're inviting your own crowd, your own audience to participate or to engage or to watch nowadays with social media, to view the debate, which means that you're giving the other side a platform and an audience from your own crowd. Now, why is that problematic? Because as I said earlier, the other side might win an argument or two. I'm not saying that falsehood will ultimately achieve victory over the truth. However, because of my weakness, because of the weakness of the individual engaging in these polemical debates, they might err, they might make a mistake, they might make an argument that was not strong enough. The other side might resort to, logical fallacies or other means to sow the seeds of doubt within your own audience. So you're there trying to guide them or their crowd to the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but you actually do the opposite. You actually make your own crowd, essentially, even if you don't lose them, even if they don't, adopt the other side's viewpoint, you might create cracks in their beliefs. And those cracks might end up getting bigger and bigger down the line, which is not something you want to do. So giving a platform. So I want to mention a couple of hadith here to kind of elaborate on these things before we wrap up the class, inshallah. This hadith is in Amal al-Saduq. He narrates from his father, عن الحميري, عن ابن عيسى, عن أبيه, عن ابن أبي عمير, عن محمد ibn Himran. Now, Ibn Abi Umayr and Muhammad ibn Himran, both great companions. عن أبي عبيدة الحذاء قال قال أبو جعفر عليه السلام. Imam al-Baqir, he said to Ziyad, Ya Ziyad, إياك والخصومات. Beware, avoid. خصومات, meaning these polemical discussions. إياك فالخصومات. Don't engage in them. Don't try to proselytize, unless, obviously it's not mentioned here in this hadith, unless you have those conditions. And those conditions are exclusive to a very small elite group of people. إياك والخصومات فإنها تورث الشك, because they inherit doubt. Meaning the person engaging in those debates, not just the audience, not just the crowd, not just the viewership, but the person himself or herself might begin to develop doubts. فَإِنَّهَا تُورِث, meaning down the line, ultimately it culminates into doubt. وَتُحْبِطُ الْعَمَلِ, and it might destroy all your deeds. وَتُرْدِي صَاحِبَهَا, and it makes the people who engage in these debates fall. وَتُرْدِي صَاحِبَهَا وَعَسَى أَن يَتَكَلَّمَ الرَّجُلُ بِالشَّيْءٍ لَا يُغْفَرُ لَهُ وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ. The Imam says, sometimes a person might say one thing for which they will never be forgiven. In other words, in the context of a debate, because it's a very fast-paced environment, because you're trying to make a point and try to win the argument at any expense, at any cost, oftentimes you end up saying things that you regret. لا يغفر له. And those things will never be forgiven. Meaning that now that the word has come out, it'll be used against you, it'll be used against your faith. The Imam isn't elaborating on why this is an unforgivable sin, but it could be all of these factors. It could be that you did something which caused doubt to creep into the hearts of the audience. It could be that you said something which presented your argument and your faith as being weak and unable to respond to those allegations or to those arguments, essentially tarnishing the reputation of the faith. Whatever it may be, لا يغفر له. This person will never be forgiven. It could be that you make a concession, and this concession is so grave and so problematic and so damaging that this sin will never be forgiven. It could be that you reject the hadith simply because you're unable to respond to the arguments against it. You're unable to justify or rationalize it, which again is one of the biggest problems that people who engage in polemical debates fall into nowadays. There is an entire group of people. Again, I'm not singling any individual out, but there is an entire group of people who are otherwise well-meaning. They're trying to do the right thing. They're trying to present tashayyu' as the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. They're trying to defend the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt, but in doing so, they end up causing more harm than good. They end up rejecting the ahadith of the Ahlul Bayt, established principles, established beliefs, and even get pushed into a corner where they begin to attack our ulama. They begin to attack, and this is something that we're seeing nowadays. They're attacking Allama al-Majlisi, for example, because there are ahadith in Bihar al-Anwar that they, using their weak and incapacitated brain, are unable to explain or rationalize to the other side. There are many things that in our faith are matters of belief, which you can only believe if you have full submission in the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You can't rationalize it. You can't justify it. You can't explain it even. It is what it is. Right? It is what it is. Whether you like it or not, this is what I believe in. A good friend of mine, Mahdi Hassan, the journalist and presenter, and I'm sure you're all familiar with him. He once made a remark in which he was interviewing Richard Dawkins, the avowed atheist, the high priest of the atheist church, so to speak. And Richard Dawkins tried to corner him. And he said to him, the debate is available online. He said to him, or the interview rather, he said, "Do you believe that your prophet sat on a winged horse and he ascended to the heaven?" And obviously he was referring to the Mi'raj. And in saying this, the crowd burst into laughter. The way it was presented made it extremely comical. And anybody who tries to picture that the prophet is sitting on a winged horse and flying off into the outer space, and there were many Muslims there. There were many people wearing hijab, many Muslims in the audience, and they all burst into laughter, right? Mahdi Hassan's response was admirable. And I told him, I said, many others probably would have faltered here. They probably would have conceded. He said to him, "I'm a Muslim, so yes, I believe that. I believe the Prophet ascended in the heavens." Again, to the laughter of the audience, including Muslims, right? But the fact that he stood his ground is not only admirable, but I think that's an exception. It's not the rule. Most people in that position would have conceded and said, "Well, maybe it's not like that. I mean, it's not how you describe it. Maybe it was like a spiritual ascension. It wasn't physical. It wasn't." A lot of people would have faltered. And so once you're in that position, you are in hot waters. You are in a very difficult, like, for example, when you're on Hard Talk, the famous BBC program, it's very difficult to make your case and to not make concessions and to not falter and to not appear weak, right? So Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, or Imam al-Baqir rather, is telling Ziyad that, let's go back to the slides here. He's telling him that you may say things for which you will never be forgiven. And this happens, again, remember the Imam's words, he says, yurithu shak. This will inherit doubt, meaning that you start out with firm beliefs. You go in there trying to establish the faith of the Ahlul Bayt. And you start with the most obvious, the most solid case that we have. The succession of the Prophet, that it was Amirul Mu'mineen who was the successor. So you start off there, and it's, you kind of have all these slam dunk arguments. All the arguments are strong, are well articulated, they're well presented. But then, when you start getting into the nitty gritty, when you start getting into the furu', into the branches, not the fundamentals, when you start getting into the detailed nuances of tashayyu', which, as I said, many of them are matters of belief based on submission. You have to submit, you have to believe that is what it is, whether you like it or not, right? But once you get to those details, a lot of people begin to falter. And so as a consequence of that, they begin to reject the ahadith en masse, right? They begin to, again, the way this leads into ma la yughfaru lah, as the Imam says, committing sins, is you fall into the trap of the other side. The other side, when you tell them that this hadith in Sahih Muslim, Musnad al-Hakim or whatever, they'll resort to Rijali polemics. They'll say, well, the isnad of this hadith, who's this person? This is majhul, this is mursal, this is that. And so these individuals from our side, they begin to adopt this methodology. And this methodology then leads them to rejecting our ahadith. And in the name of polishing hadith heritage and Shia literature, they begin to reject the ahadith, and it causes them to commit these sins. La yughfaru lah. Ya Ziyad, the Imam then said, إِنَّهُ كَانَ فِي مَا مَضَى قَوْمٌ. There was a group before. The Imam doesn't say when, but he says there was a group of people. تَرَكُوا عِلْمَ مَا وُكِّلُوا بِهِ وَطَلَبُوا عِلْمَ مَا كُفُّوهُ. They left the knowledge of things that were relevant to them, عِلْمَ مَا وُكِّلُوا بِهِ, meaning the things that they were supposed to learn, right? You have to learn, you have to educate yourself about God, about the Prophet, about the Imam. Focus on these, prioritize these. The Imam says they abandoned these things which they must have prioritized. They left them aside. وَطَلَبُوا عِلْمَ مَا كُفُّوهُ. Then they were after the knowledge that has been made sufficient for them, meaning the knowledge of the things that you're simply supposed to submit to. You're not supposed to engage in these discussions, right? You're not supposed to talk about the nitty-gritty and the details. It's not your job. As someone who establishes the foundations, you simply believe in the rest. And again, we talked about this in culture, in Islamic culture class. We talked about it in theology. Islam is about submission. Islam is about accepting what the Prophet brought you, what the Imam brought you. No questions asked. Why engage in those discussions and end up falling? وَطَلِبُوا عِلْمَ مَا كُفُّوهُ حَتَّى انْتَهَى بِهِمُ الْكَلَامِ إِلَى اللَّهِ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ فَتَحَيَّرُوا. The Imam said ultimately that led them into discussions that involved Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, meaning the attributes and the nuances and the philosophical discussions that happen. فَتَحَيَّرُوا. And they became bewildered. They became confused. They lost the plot, right? And the rest of the hadith actually suggests that they became insane. Whether that insanity is in the literal sense of the word or insanity in terms of their beliefs is something else. I want to share this hadith with you. I don't know if we have enough time actually. Should we leave it until the next session? Or I think because we don't have another class today, I think it's worth mentioning this hadith. If you agree to read the hadith, recite the salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli. Okay. The hadith is here. It's a relatively lengthy hadith, but I'll mention passages from it. Okay. This hadith is from I'lam al-Wara, as well as Irshad al-Mufid. And it's found in Bihar al-Anwar. Let me actually just copy and paste this, so you can follow along the Arabic version. Okay. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Okay. All right. So, ابن قولويه عن الكليني عن علي عن أبيه عن جماعة من رجاله عن يونس بن يعقوب قال كنت عند أبي عبد الله عليه السلام فورد عليه رجل من أهل الشام. He says, I was with Imam al-Sadiq when a man from Sham, from Damascus, came to him. Ahl al-Sham, generally speaking, were not friendly with the Ahlul Bayt. They were, they held a lot of animus towards the Imams. فقال له إني رجل صاحب كلام وفقه وفرائض. The Shami came and he presented his credentials. He said, I'm a man who is well versed in kalam, meaning polemical discussions, debates, philosophical arguments. وفقه وفرائض. My command of jurisprudence is also very good. وقد جئت لمناظرة أصحابك. And I came to debate your followers. فقال له أبو عبد الله عليه السلام كلامك هذا من كلام رسول الله أو من عندك. Is this what you just told me? Is this from the teachings of the Prophet or is it from you? فقال من كلام رسول الله بعضه ومن عندي بعضه. Part of it is from the Prophet and part of it is from me. فقال له أبو عبد الله عليه السلام فأنت إذن شريك رسول الله. Well, that makes you a partner to the Holy Prophet. قال لا. Are you a partner? Are you on equal footing with the Prophet? He said no. The Imam said فسمعت الوحي من عند الله. Did you receive this as revelation from God? In other words, what you're about to debate us with, did you get it from the Prophet or you came up with it? The Imam then said, did you get this from God? قال لا. No. قال فتجب طاعتك كما تجب طاعة رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله. Is your obedience obligatory just like the Holy Prophet? He said no. قال فالتفت أبو عبد الله عليه السلام إليه. Imam al-Sadiq at this point looked at Yunus ibn Yaqub and he said to him, يا يونس ibn Yaqub هذا قد خصم نفسه قبل أن يتكلم. This man just defeated himself. He just beat himself even before speaking. قال يونس لو كنت تحسن الكلام لكلمته. قال يا يونس, excuse me. The Imam then said to Yunus, oh Yunus, if you had the ability to engage with him, then you would have. In other words, you don't have, Yunus ibn Abd al-Rahman, the Imam said to him, you don't have the capacity, you don't have the knowledge to engage with him. Yunus said, فَيَا لَهَا مِنْ حَسْرَةٍ. I truly regret this, that I don't have the ability. فَقُلْتُ جُعِلْتُ فِدَاكَ سَمِعْتُكَ تَنْهَا عَنِ الْكَلَامِ. Listen to this. Yunus then said to the Imam, I've heard you warn us not to engage in kalam, meaning not to engage in these polemical debates. وَتَقُولُ وَيْلٌ لِأَصْحَابِ الْكَلَامِ. Woe unto the people who engage in these polemics. يقولون هذا ينقاد وهذا لا ينقاد وهذا ينساق وهذا لا ينساق وهذا نعقله وهذا لا نعقله. Essentially, he's quoting the Imam as having said to his followers not to engage in these discussions. فقال أبو عبد الله عليه السلام إنما قلت ويل لقوم تركوا قولي. Listen very carefully. The Imam said, I said woe unto the ones who engage in polemical debates, but what I meant was those who don't quote me. In other words, if you're going to engage in these polemical debates, you don't resort to your own methodologies. You don't resort to any other mechanism outside the fold of the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. إنما قلت ويل لقوم تركوا قولي وذهبوا إلى ما يريدون. People who abandoned us and tried to make their case using their own way. Right? Now, let me open two parentheses here. We've talked about this before. There are individuals out there who unabashedly and shamelessly say that when you're engaging with with other denominations, other religious groups and whatnot, you can't resort to the Quran or to Hadith scriptures. You can't resort to the teachings of God and the Prophet and the Imams. Why? Because these verses and these hadiths are not logical arguments. We need logical arguments, right? The Imam is saying the exact opposite. He says that if you wish to engage with them, you must use the verses of the Quran, the teachings of the Quran, and the hadith of the Ahlul Bayt. So to write an entire book about philosophy and not quote a single verse or hadith of the Ahlul Bayt is incredibly problematic. And we mean no disrespect to people who do this, but this is not the way of the Ahlul Bayt, right? وذهبوا إلى ما يريدون ثم قال اخرج إلى الباب فانظر من ترى من المتكلمين فأدخله. The Imam then said to Yunus ibn Abd al-Rahman, go to the door and see who you find from among those who are well versed in these polemical debates, bring them in. قال فخرجت فوجدت حمران بن أعين. Now, in other words, the Imam is telling him, go get my companions who are good at this. So he brought Himran ibn A'yan, who is an incredible companion. We've talked about him in previous classes. He was the brother of Zurara. وَكَانَ يُحْسِنُ الْكَلَامِ. Yunus says that he was very good at this. Himran ibn A'yan would often debate with people. He was good at it. ومحمد ibn النعمان الأحول وكان متكلما. He was also a good debater. وهشام ibn Salim وقيس الماصر وكان متكلمين, who were also good. فأدخلتهم عليه. He went after them, collected them, brought them to the Imam. فلما استقر بنا المجلس وكنا في خيمة لأبي عبد الله عليه السلام. We sat down, we got ready. على طرف جبل في طرف الحرم. We sat in a corner of the haram, meaning Masjid al-Haram. وذلك قبل الحج بأيام. And this was a few days prior to the beginning of the pilgrimage, the Hajj. أخرج أبو عبد الله عليه السلام رأسه من الخيمة. The Imam stuck his head out of the tent where they were all seated. فإذا هو ببعير يخب فقال هشام ورب الكعبة. The Imam saw a camel approaching and he said, by the Lord of the Kaaba, it is Hisham. Meaning the Imam rejoiced that Hisham was approaching, meaning Hisham ibn al-Hakam. Listen to this. فظننا أن هشاما رجل من ولد عقيل. He said, Yunus ibn Abd al-Rahman says that I thought Hisham was a reference to one of the relatives of Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam. كان شديد المحبة لأبي عبد الله. He loved the Imam loved him. That's why the Imam was so happy to see him. فإذا هشام ibn al-Hakam. As it turns out, it was Hisham al-Hakam, this young companion of Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam. وقد ورد وهو أول ما اختطت لحيته. He says when he came, we could barely see his beard line, meaning he was so young, he had just reached puberty, right? His beard line was barely coming out. وَلَيْسَ فِينَا إِلَّا مَنْ هُوَ أَكْبَرُ مِنْهُ سِنًّا. And every single person in that tent was older than him. He was the youngest. قال فوسع إليه أبو عبد الله عليه السلام. Imam al-Sadiq asked everyone to make room and space for Hisham ibn al-Hakam. Salam Allah alayh. وقال ناصرنا بقلبه ولسانه ويده. Our ally, our supporter, our helper with his heart, with his tongue, and with his hand. ثم قال لحمران. Then Imam al-Sadiq addressed Himran. Subhanallah. Is it possible, Ya Hujjat ibn al-Hasan, that we may be able to reach a level in knowledge and in conviction and in devotion and in commitment to your cause, that we reach that station where the Imam would welcome us and treat us in the same manner and accept us as helpers of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, both in our hearts as well as our tongues and our hands? Inshallah. The Imam then addressed Himran. He said to him, كلم الرجل. I want you to debate this Shami man, this person who came from Sham. فتكلم حمران فظهر عليه. Himran spoke and he was able to beat him. He was able to defeat him in the discussion. Then the Imam said, Ya Taqi, meaning Mu'min al-Taq, who was one of the other companions of the Imam. He said to him, Ya Taqi, kallimhu. He spoke to him, he debated him, فظهر عليه. He won the debate. Right? ثم قال يا هشام ابن سالم كلمه. The Imam then said to Hisham ibn Salim, debate him. فتعارف ثم قال لقيس الماصر كلمه فكلمه وأقبل أبو عبد الله عليه السلام فتبسم من كلامهما وقد استخذل الشامي. After each one of the companions of Imam al-Sadiq عليه السلام defeated the Shami in his arguments, in his polemics, the Imam smiled. وقد استخذل الشامي في يده. The Shami was afflicted with khudlan. He looked visibly defeated and broken. ثم قال للشامي كلم هذا الغلام. He said to him, now speak to this young man, to this boy, Hisham ibn al-Hakam. يعني هشام بن الحكم. فقال نعم, sure. ثم قال الشامي لهشام يا غلام سلني في إمامة هذا. The Shami said to Hisham, tell me about the imama of this person, meaning Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam. فغضب هشام حتى ارتعد. Hisham was so enraged to the point where he began to shake. ثم قال أخبرني يا هذا أربك أنظر لخلقه أم هم لأنفسهم. He said to him, who is more caring toward the creatures? Is it God or is it themselves? The Shami responded by saying بل ربي أنظر لخلقه. قال ففعل بنظره لهم في دينهم ماذا. So what did God do then? He cares for the people. What did he do in terms of their religion? قال كلفهم وأقام لهم حجة ودليلا على ما كلفهم. God made things obligatory upon them and he gave them proof and evidence. وأزاح في ذلك عللهم. فقال له الشامي فما هذا الدليل الذي نصبه لهم. He said, well, what proof did God present to the people? قال الشامي هو رسول الله. He said, the Prophet was the proof. The Prophet was the one who established religion. So Hisham said to him, فبعد رسول الله من? What about after the Prophet? The Shami said, الكتاب والسنة, the Quran and the tradition of the Prophet. قال هشام فهل نفعنا اليوم الكتاب والسنة فيما اختلفنا فيه. Aren't there so many disagreements amongst us today despite having the Quran and Sunnah? All these differences that we have, all these different faiths and sects and denominations and beliefs, and look at the Muslim nation, look at the sorry state of Islam today. Has the Quran and the Sunnah resolved those differences? حتى رفع عنا الاختلاف ومكنا من الاتفاق. The Shami responded by saying, Naam, yes, that has resolved all the differences. Hisham then said to him, فَلِمَ اخْتَلَفْنَا نَحْنُ وَأَنْتَ. Then why are you and I in dispute? Why is it that we are not in congruence? Why don't we believe in the same thing then? وَجِئْتَنَا مِنَ الشَّامِ تُخَالِفُنَا. You've come all the way from Sham to debate with us, and then you say all the differences have been resolved. وتزعم أن الرأي طريق الدين وأنت مقر بأن الرأي لا يجمع على القول الواحد المختلفين. فسكت الشامي كالمفكر. The Shami, he sat quietly as though he was thinking. He didn't have an answer. فقال له أبو عبد الله عليه السلام ما لك لا تتكلم. Why don't you respond to him, to Hisham ibn al-Hakam? قال إن قلت إنا ما اختلفنا كابرت. Because if I tell him that we don't have any differences, then I'd be lying. وإن قلت إن الكتاب والسنة يرفعان عنا الاختلاف. And if I said that the Quran and the Sunnah end all disputes and differences, أبطلت. Again, that would be falsehood. That's not the truth. لأنهما يحتملان الوجوه. Because the Quran and Sunnah can be misinterpreted in different ways. لكن لي عليه مثل ذلك. فقال له أبو عبد الله عليه السلام سله تجده مليا. Then Imam al-Sadiq said to Hisham, to the Shami, ask anything you have from Hisham, you will find your answer with him. You'll find him more than capable to respond. Then, again, as I said, the hadith is a very lengthy one. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. The part I want to get to is this. Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, let me see if I can find it here. Here it is. Look at this part here. This is what it all comes down to. Eventually, after a lengthy discussion, فأقبل أبو عبد الله عليه السلام على حمران. The Imam then turned to his companions. First, he looked at Himran. Again, Himran ibn A'yan, the brother of Zurara. فقال يا حمران. تجري الكلام على الأثر فتصيب. When you speak based on athar, and athar here could be the words of the Prophet and the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt. The Imam said to him, you get it right because this is what you do. والتفت إلى هشام بن سالم فقال تريد الأثر ولا تعرف. You are looking for the truth, but you don't have it. You don't have a solid background. ثم التفت إلى الأحوال فقال قياس رواغ تكسر باطلا بباطل. You're trying to defeat falsehood with falsehood. لكن باطلك أظهر. Even though your falsehood is able to defeat his falsehood, but it's still falsehood. So the Imam is critiquing and criticizing his companions. ثم التفت إلى قيس الماصر فقال يتكلم وأقرب ما يكون من الخبر عن الرسول صلى الله عليه وآله ما يكون منه يمزج الحق بالباطل. You mix truth with falsehood, right? وقليل الحق يكفي عن كثير الباطل. You don't need to mix truth with falsehood, because a little truth can defeat a lot of falsehood, right? You don't need to resort to this. Then the Imam said to him, أنت والأحول قفازان. You and Ahwal, you jump from one topic to another. حاذقان. You're good at it, right? But that's not how you debate. قال يونس بن يعقوب وظننت والله أنه يقول لهشام قريبا مما قال لهما. And I thought that the Imam was going to criticize Hisham just as he criticized his own companions. فقال يا هشام لا تكاد تقع تلوي رجليك إذا هممت بالأرض طرت. The Imam said to him, you are like someone who takes off from the ground and flies. مثلك فليكلم الناس. People like you should speak to the people. Meaning, it's you and individuals that can fulfill your characteristics and conditions that should engage in these debates. اتق الزلة والشفاعة من ورائك. Beware of slipping, meaning the Imam is not giving him a blank check. The Imam is not saying you're the best, do whatever you want. The Imam said be careful. In other words, even Husham ibn al-Hakam is at a position where he could falter, he could slip. The Imam said to him, be careful, وَالشَّفَاعَةُ مِنْ وَرَائِكَ, and our intercession is behind you, meaning that we will support you, inshallah. Now, why I've said all of this is because it's very, very, very critical, brothers and sisters, that polemical debates, they obviously have their place and they have their time, but it's important that we acknowledge that they have a place and time. And they have people who can engage in these discussions, and not everyone should be doing this. Just because you happen to be from another background and then you convert, and now you have to go back and debate every single person from your own previous background, is not how it goes. Just because you happen to be young and motivated and feel oppressed and feel as though you can make a good solid case doesn't mean you should, right? You have to be well grounded. If you became like Allam al-Balaghi, if you became like Sayyid Abdul Hussein Sharafuddin, if you became someone like Al-Allam al-Amini, well, that's a whole other discussion. That becomes your field of expertise. Otherwise, steer clear from all of this. There is an entire discussion, and I'll wrap up with this, about the concept of taqiyya, dissimulation, where the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt at times have told companions not to preach to their own family members. I'm not saying this applies. Don't get my point wrong. I'm not saying that you should not debate with anyone, you shouldn't engage with anyone, but there are times where the Imams have been very explicit about this. Don't even invite your own brother. Don't even invite your own family members. Just focus on yourself, focus on improving your own beliefs and your own faith and spirituality, and stick to that, right? So the activist generation out there that engage in these discussions with every single imposter, every liar, every deceiver, every attacker, that's not how it goes. Because again, there are many side effects to that, and we've talked about them. I do apologize. I went way over my allocated time. And so in the interest of brevity and time, I will skip the questions and answers. And instead, I will simply copy them and hopefully respond to them in the next session. What I also want to do is I'll paste the English translation of the hadith that we mentioned earlier. And if somebody can find the translation of the last hadith, that would be wonderful. Otherwise, I believe I provided a relatively satisfactory translation on the fly. Oh yes, okay, so I see that Taqi has pasted the English translation of that hadith. So that's wonderful. So you have it in your in the chat box. All right. Okay, so as I said, I'm simply going to copy the questions and hopefully respond to them in the next session. Thank you so much, my dear brothers and sisters. May Allah bless you, inshallah. And we'll see you next time. Tomorrow, we've got more classes. So I don't know how many of you sent in your assignment, which was given to you last week about the differences between the biblical and Quranic narratives of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. If you haven't sent it in, do send it. I'll give you an extension of 1 week, inshallah, until next class. I just want you to do a little bit research on that if you haven't done so already. Jazakumullah khair. May Allah bless you. I do beg for your prayers. These are the last days of the holy month of Ramadan. Traditions tell us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgives more people as we progress towards the last night than He has throughout the holy month. So, you know, the month is still ongoing. Don't assume that it's over. Do pray for the reappearance of the Master. Do pray for this sinful slave. And inshallah, I'll keep you in your prayers as well. Jazakumullah khair, barakallah fikum. One last thing I wanted to say is the situation we had with PayPal has been resolved, alhamdulillah. So for those of you who wanted to send in their administration fee to PayPal but held off because of the issue that we had, you can do so now. So there's a little good news right there for you. Jazakumullah khair. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى اللهم على محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين.